Welcome everyone today. My name is Ashley Smithers from Clark Conservation District. You are joining us for a webinar on Stormwater and Amphibians presented by Katie Holzer. Katie is a watershed scientist with the city of Gresham, Oregon, where she conducts studies on stormwater pollutants. She has a Ph.D. in ecology, where she focused her studies on amphibian habitats in urban and agricultural areas in the Pacific Northwest. She has been a member of the amphibian community in Portland and Vancouver for many years, and it's such a wealth of knowledge. We are so excited to have her join us today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Katie, and we're going to share some info about who is joining us today.
Great. We got a quarter of the people are a member of the public. We also have some students and nonprofit NGOs and land managers. So thank you all for being here. Since there's a variety of people here, I'm going to be touching sort of on different levels of things. And so hopefully there'll be something for everyone in here. So just to show you what we're going to be talking about today, we'll start with some Stormwater 101. So it sounds like there might be some stormwater professionals here, so you can kind of tune out during that portion if you already know what's going on. And then I'll talk a lot about amphibians and how they use the stormwater ponds as habitat. And then I'll get really specifically into this really cool study that we did last year on tadpole toxicity in these stormwater ponds. And there'll be some graphs and stuff. So if that's over your head, you can tune out for that part. And in the end, I'll wrap it together and show you how you can help these amphibians in our area. And in the Clark County area, you have a lot of amphibians that live in the city, in the farmlands, in the rural area. They're sort of all throughout, and it's the same thing down in Gresham, and we tend to have the same suite of species here. And for background on myself, I grew up in a village in the rural areas of Minnesota, and I spent time catching tadpoles and playing with frogs. And I moved out to the Pacific Northwest to go to college, and during that time I realized that I could sort of study these processes and the things affecting them even more, and I could turn it into a job. And so that's what I got excited about doing. And when I started my thesis in college, I was looking at the amphibians that lived in the Portland metro area, and I didn't know what I was doing. I just got myself a field guide and went out there and was trying to look through and see what in the world frog and salamanders I was looking at. And then I ended up turning that all into a PhD looking at amphibian habitat in urban and agricultural areas. And I was really surprised to find that the main habitat type for a lot of these native species were these stormwater ponds that I'm going to be talking about, which are completely human constructed. There's nothing that used to be on the landscape, and yet they were providing really important habitat. And so now for the last 6 years, I've been working with the city of Gresham as a watershed scientist, where I look specifically at the water quality of the stormwater runoff, of these ponds, how well they're cleaning it, and of what's ending up in the streams as well. All right, so let's start off with, let's move here. What is stormwater? So I'm gonna play this little video I took in Gresham, where here's what happens when it rains in a city. So here, there's all sorts of pollutants coming off of these cars as they drive by, coming out of the air, and you can see them running into the storm drain here. It's some nice black water. And if there wasn't pavement here, that water would naturally be soaking into the ground, filtering through the soil, recharging the groundwater, and eventually making its way to streams. But when you're in an area that has pavement or other reasons that the water can't soak into the ground, it tends to get drained off somewhere through a pipe. And here's an example where that storm drain, that catch basin, is just going right here. It's just a pipe that goes directly to the nearest stream. And you can see that black water coming straight off the road and straight into the stream. Right here, this is Kelly Creek, which flows into Beaver Creek, which flows into the Sandy River, which flows into the Columbia River. And this is a place where there are endangered salmon living here, there are beavers, there are otters, there's all sorts of things trying to live in these creeks, and every time it rains, they're getting assaulted with all these pollutants that are washing directly off the road without any treatment at all. And I know up until a few years ago when I got into this field, I had no idea that water went directly there. In my mind, I thought it went to some treatment plant somewhere and got cleaned first. And in a few places that's true, but the vast majority of places, those grates are just there to get water off the road as quickly as possible so people can drive. They have nothing to do with cleaning that water. They're just trying to get it to the nearest creek as quickly as possible. And so that's a big problem for all the animals that are trying to live there. Here's another example where here's a couple of pipes coming into one of our stormwater facilities, where this pipe has good clean water coming in, and this pipe has water from a construction site that had a lot of runoff of soil coming off. And you can see all of this soil that's coming into the stormwater facility. And this is bringing with it all sorts of pollutants, especially pesticides that have been caught up in that soil over the years. And so everything that's trying to live in this wetland and everything that lives downstream now has to deal with that. Okay, so I'm going to go over some of the major classes of stormwater pollutants that we find. And so stormwater is just that water that's running off of the surfaces when it rains. The first one is lawn fertilizers. So a lot of times people don't think of, putting fertilizer on their lawn as being a potential pollutant, but those nutrients that help the grass grow, sometimes there can be a lot of nutrients, and when those wash off into the ponds or streams, they can cause other plants to grow, like algae. This is an example of when I was trying to filter a sample that I was taking the other day, and there was so much algae in there that it just got all caught up in the syringe. So when so much algae grows and creates these algae blooms, there can be toxic algae. Even if the algae itself isn't toxic, when it dies, the decomposition can eat up all the oxygen in the water, and then the animals that need the oxygen can die. That's why you'll often see fish kills in places where there's too much fertilizer running into the water. There's dirt, like I talked about, that can come from construction or from bare ground that doesn't have plants on it. This is an area where when it rained, all this dirt was washing into the ditch, which washed into the nearby creek. And the dirt itself can be a pollutant because it can smother different animals, especially salmon eggs or bugs that are trying to live between the rocks. But that dirt also brings a lot of other pollutants with it, especially, like I mentioned, pesticides. We find a lot of DDT, which is a pesticide that was banned now almost 50 years ago, and we still find it in the streams when the dirt that had DDT applied to it, 60 years ago washes into the stream because it's so persistent. There's a lot of different pollutants from cars. The big roads are where we tend to see the most pollutants. There's, of course, the oil dripping from the cars or antifreeze. There's dust that comes off of the brake pads that have heavy metals in them. There's the dust and particles that come off of tires, which also have heavy metals, and they have particular chemicals. There's been a recent study that determined there's a chemical called 6-PPD quinone, which is known to be deadly to salmon when it washes into the streams. And that's a big reason that we tend to see a lot of salmon in urban areas dying right before they can spawn, and it's because of this chemical in tires. And then a huge category of chemicals are lots of different types of pesticides. And this can mean many different things. There's herbicides, there's rodenticides, there's fungicides, there's insecticides, and a lot of these are things that are used pretty commonly in the area. This says weed and free. That's supposed to say weed and feed. Has an herbicide called 2,4-D that we see in a lot of our samples. Roundup has a pesticide called glyphosate that we see in a lot of our samples. Mouse and rat poison. Fungicides, including there's things called brown spot maintenance for lawns. Insecticides are a really big problem we're seeing in the streams, because if something's made to kill insects on land, it usually kills insects in the water too. And those insects in the water are really important for the ecological function of the ponds and streams. Especially they're important for fish food and food for other animals. One that we've been seeing a lot is called Bifenthrin, which is often used as a perimeter spray for houses that you might put around the bottom to keep ants out. And that's one that we're seeing being especially toxic in the streams. So something like this, a stormwater pond can help clean those pollutants. So what this is an example in Gresham of when new neighborhoods are built, a couple of lots are set aside and something like this is put in, a type of constructed wetland. And these ponds help to clean the pollutants out of the stormwater in lots of different ways. They also help to detain the water and hold it a little bit so it can infiltrate down, recharge the groundwater, and not go to the stream so quickly to cause erosion. And here's examples of some of the ways that the ponds actually help clean those pollutants. Those nutrients that I talked about, like in fertilizer, the plants can take them up and the microbes in the soil can change them into forms that don't cause algae bloom. The sediment that I talked about, it can settle as the water slows, it can filter as it moves through the soil. The heavy metals often bind to the soil particles themselves and get filtered out. And many pesticides will bind to those soil particles, and the microbes can actually help them change form into something that's less toxic. And so you might be wondering, okay, so all this stuff is bound up in the soil and the plants, what happens to it then? So depending on the type of facility, either every year or maybe every 3 or 5 years, we'll go in and we'll scoop out the sediment, take out the plants, test them. I do all sorts of different tests to see which pollutants are in there and what level, and then they'll get disposed of in a proper facility. Usually they end up going to a landfill, like where your garbage goes as well. And here's just an example of some of my samples of what some of the runoff looks like coming into one of these ponds and what it looks like leaving. So these ponds help to clean the water before the water goes into the stream. And this will show you what it looks like to detain that water. So here's one of the new facilities that was built in one of our new housing developments. This is what it looks like when it's not raining. There's sort of some water that flows through this facility here. And then this is a picture that I took during a really big rainstorm we had in December of 2015. And so that whole thing fills up like a bathtub and then drains out really slowly. And what that does is it helps to slow down the water so that as it's running off of all that pavement so quickly, it doesn't rush to the stream and cause downcutting and erosion in the stream. And this is an example of what that looks like. This is an area in Gresham that when it was built, when all of its houses and roads were put in, they didn't have these stormwater detention ponds and all the water just rushed there really quickly. And the stream used to be way up here. And as all that flashy flow of stormwater came in, it cut down and down and down. And it's almost hard to see here, but a person's only about this tall right here if they're standing at the bottom of this waterfall. This is now an almost 30-foot deep complete channel that's been formed by erosion. So stormwater ponds help with that. And then something the reason I came upon stormwater is that they also start to function as habitat. So this is that same facility that I show fill up like a bathtub. This is what it looks like if you go out there in the spring. You'll probably see bees and butterflies and birds flying around. And then if you come and look closely in the water, you will actually see all of these little tadpoles down here swimming around. And so these are from frogs that came and laid their eggs here, and now they're developing into tadpoles, and they'll go through metamorphosis and leave the pond again. And so it's not just habitat in that they're stopping through for a little bit of time and then moving on. This is their home. This is where, you know, the babies are born and raised and where they'll come back and raise the next generation as well. This is their habitat. And the reason it's such an important habitat for them is that, especially as agricultural and urban areas come in, most of the existing wetlands get either filled in or drained in some way. So all of this wetland habitat has disappeared over the last 150 years. And when these stormwater ponds are built, they're reintroducing some wetland habitat into an area that used to have a lot. And so all these species that used to use the extensive wetlands had nowhere to go, and now they have these ponds that they can come to. And we find that they surprisingly come back really quickly. Usually within a year or two, we'll see animals coming in and using them. And there have been a couple of papers on this that you can check out. You might notice an author here, Ashley Smithers, who introduced me. So she is an author on one of these papers looking at amphibians using stormwater ponds and other urban areas as habitat. And here's a similar paper that I wrote talking about amphibian use of constructed ponds in an urban area. And a couple things I just wanted to point out is that when you look at some of these ponds, you might look at it and you're like, okay, this is some small, dirty little pond with some cattails in it. How could that possibly be habitat? But then when you actually go and look, there's, for example, the red-legged frog breeding there, which is a species of conservation concern. And this is an example of one of the graphs from the first study that I did, where here are 4 different species of native amphibians here. There's that red-legged frog that we're somewhat concerned about for conservation. And this is the proportion of different types of ponds that I found occupied by them. So every time there's a pond, how likely is it that the species is in there? And the lighter colored bars are the natural ponds. So any given natural pond, about 1 in 5 might have them, or up to 1 in 2 had one. But when you look at the constructed ponds, which were mostly stormwater ponds, the proportions are even a little bit bigger. Up to 60 or 70% of the ponds would have some of these species. And so what we're finding is that the frogs and salamanders don't really care if it's a natural pond or a constructed pond. They care if it has the attributes they need. Is it the right depth? Does it have water long enough in the year? Does it have plants that they can attach their eggs on? Does it have algae they can graze on? Does it have, the bugs that the salamander larvae will eat? These are the things that are important to them. They don't care who built it or when it got there, as long as they can get there and it has the features they need. So I'm going to show you just some pictures of what some of these ponds look like that are a really great habitat. These are some really large ponds that are used to treat stormwater from dozens of acres in Gresham. Here are some neighborhood ponds, which are a lot more common. You probably see these more often in sort of new subdivisions that are being built. And all the ponds I'm showing you are ones where we've found multiple amphibian species breeding, especially ones of conservation concern in Gresham. And then here's some other examples of types of neighborhood ponds. Some of them you might not even know. Here's just a little ditch and you would never know that something bred there unless you went and looked. And then even yard ponds. This is a resident in Gresham who decided to put a little plastic liner down, put a couple plants in there. And within a year, she was getting Pacific tree frogs breeding in there, long-toed salamanders, and then even this year for the first time, she got a northwestern salamander, which is a more rare species and lays these really big egg masses, just in this tiny little pond she built. And she didn't come and bring any of those there. She just made the habitat, and then the animals came and found it themselves. Okay, so I've been throwing out some names of some of these species. I'll show you, these are the species that you're likely to find in Clark County. These are what we find in Gresham as well. These are the common species. So there's 3 frogs and 8 salamanders here. All of these are native except for the bullfrog, which is from the southeastern US. It's introduced. And then you can kind of break these down into where they breed. All of these top species are aquatic species, meaning they breed in water of some kind. Most of them breed in ponds. This last one, the Pacific giant salamander, breeds in streams, but all the rest of them breed in ponds. And then we have the terrestrial amphibians. So these are ones that stay on land their whole life, and they'll lay their eggs under a rotting log or in a pile of cobbles or something like that. So here's just a basic aquatic amphibian life cycle. So you have your adult frog that will go and lay some eggs. Those eggs hatch in the water into tiny little tadpoles, and then those tadpoles will eventually grow some legs and go through metamorphosis and come out onto land. And then the next year they'll come back to the pond and lay eggs. And similar with the aquatic salamanders, you have this adult that lives on land and it'll come lay its eggs in the pond. They'll hatch into some sort of larvae that look crazy with big feathery gills sticking out, and they're predators at this stage. And then they'll go through metamorphosis and come out onto land and repeat the cycle again the next year. Here's some examples of what some of these eggs look like when they're in the water. So in case you're ever going up to a pond and you're wondering if there are amphibian eggs there, this is the type of thing you should be looking for. So it's a blob of jelly. Sometimes it's really sloppy, sometimes it's really firm jelly, depending on the species. And then all of these little dots in here are the embryos. So this is like a chicken egg, and that's like the yolk, right? Right when it's laid, it's nice and round because it hasn't started developing at all. And then as it starts to develop, it gets longer and starts to look more like a tadpole. So you can see all of these tiny little developing embryos here. This one's about to hatch. These are about to hatch out of the egg and become free swimming tadpoles. Here's some examples of, oh, and let me tell you about the time of year. The amphibians in this area start laying their eggs in the late winter. It could be late January or in February, and they're pretty much done laying their eggs by now. So like February and March are a really great time to find amphibian eggs in the water. And then there are tadpoles. So there are some frog tadpoles. They can be of different sizes. And then here are those salamander larvae. And you can start to see some of those feathery gills kind of make them look like a dragon swimming around in the water. And these tadpoles will usually be here. They hatch in the spring. And then they'll usually be here through the summer. They'll go through metamorphosis sometime in the midsummer and generally get out of the pond. A couple of species will actually stay around the whole year and wait until the next year or later to go through metamorphosis. Right, so that's the basis of amphibians living in the stormwater ponds. A huge question that I always get, and hopefully you're thinking it right now, is wait a minute, you just told me that all these terrible, nasty pollutants are coming into these ponds, and it's the job of the ponds to clean those pollutants. And now you're telling me it's a good thing that the amphibians are living in those ponds themselves, and why is that okay? Is it okay? Are you just creating these terrible cesspools for them to come breed in, and they're just, dying and having a terrible time? And that's a question that has been plaguing me for a long time, and there are basically no studies looking at this. There's lots and lots of studies from all over the world showing that amphibians and other animals use these stormwater ponds, and pretty much no studies looking at, is that good or bad for them? Are they surviving at a better or worse rate? Are they having health effects? What's going on? And so we did a study last year. This is the first part of what will hopefully be multiple different studies looking at that, trying to determine how bad are these stormwater ponds for the amphibians that are living there. So this was a huge collaborative project. You can see there are lots of co-authors on this, and it was led by a guy named Max Lambert, who's a postdoctoral fellow at the University of California in Berkeley. So we know they use it. Is it good or bad for them? Lots of survey data. This was, as far as we know, the very first controlled experiment trying to figure out how good or bad this water is for the amphibians. And are we drawing them into what we call an ecological trap, where they're attracted to it, but it's really bad for them, and so we end up hurting the population. So the two questions that we were hoping to answer were, can the urban stormwater ponds support tadpole survival at similar rate to the forest ponds that don't have these pollutants and that aren't in urban areas? And therefore, are these urban stormwater ponds acting as ecological traps for these amphibians or not? So this is how we designed the study here. So here's Vancouver up here, here's Portland over here, this is Gresham over here. And this first round of the study we had 9 study sites different times. These 3 were urban forested sites that had frogs breeding in them. So these were natural ponds with no pollutants, and in the wild we see the frogs breeding in them. And then we had 3 sites, these pink sites, that were in an urban area in constructed ponds with those stormwater pollutants coming in, but they're places where we found the frogs breeding in the ponds in the wild. So they were coming there on their own and seemingly reproducing well. And then we also had these 3 sites, 3 white sites here that are in the urban area, that they're constructed, they have the stormwater pollutants, but we don't see frogs breeding in them naturally. And so, what's the reason they're not there? Could they be there if we brought them there, or is there something killing them? And so this study is called a reciprocal transplant experiment. So what we basically wanted to do was take the frogs that were starting out their life in these different places and divide them up and move them around to each of the other places, and then watch them grow and see how well they survive and grow. So basically we would take frog eggs out of this forested pond, take a big egg mass, divide it up into different parts, and put each one of those different parts into these different ponds. Some of them go back into the same pond, so we have a control. And we did that with many different egg masses for each site and had them all in little baggies so we can track them. And we did that for each site that had these frogs breeding. And this experiment used the red-legged frog, which is one I keep mentioning as being a species of conservation concern. So it's one of the more, it's the most sensitive species we know of in this area. So what this looked like is, here's some of those eggs in little mesh baggies so that they're getting the influence of the water. And then we had raised them out in these cages in the water. And as soon as the eggs were laid, we wanted to move them to the new pond so that all the way from being embryos are getting exposed to that new pond water. And we have them in these cages so that we know where they are and we can keep track of them. And it's to keep all the predators out as well. So we can just see what the influence of the water is without predators just coming and eating the whole experiment. And then as they grow, we go and assess their survival to see how many of them survive to metamorphosis. And all along the way, we partnered with the United States Geological Survey to do some really in-depth water quality sampling to see what sorts of pollutants were out there where the frogs are developing. And one really interesting thing happened here before I get into the end results. These baggies and these cages were made to exclude predators so they wouldn't come and eat everything. And the entire experiment was almost ruined when a lot of the eggs and tiny hatchlings were getting eaten. And I want to show you what these things look like. So here's in one of the baggies. And in here, these little black squiggly things are the red-legged frog hatchlings. And this one's still in an egg here, and its brothers and sisters hatched out early in the day. So they're pretty vulnerable. They don't really have any defenses. When they're in the egg, the jelly themselves protects them because most things can't digest that jelly. And we were really surprised to find that there were a bunch of leeches and amphipods, which are tiny crustaceans, that were getting into these baggies. They were so small that they could squeeze through the eggs at least could squeeze through these little holes, and they'd get in here and actually move through the jelly and eat the eggs. So here's an example of, these are little red-legged frog embryos here, and here's an amphipod that's inside the jelly devouring one embryo. So although it was kind of a bummer for our experiment here, one thing that was kind of interesting about it is that these sites where we're seeing a lot of amphipod predation are sites where we've seen an amphipod that is endemic just to the Portland metro area. So they only live here in the entire world. And they've been deemed the Stumptown scud is the name of this rare endemic species. So it seems like this sensitive frog is being ravaged by this rare endemic amphipod. So there's all sorts of cool battles going on in the ponds that we would otherwise not know about. Okay, so let me show you some of the water quality data here. What were we finding? And there were hundreds of different pollutants being looked at and lots of different samples throughout time. And I'm going to try to bring it down into one graph here to give you the main take-home point here. Is looking at all of the forested ponds versus all the urban ponds. This is the number of different compounds we detected, number of different pollutants. And so in general, you see this bar is higher. We tend to find more pollutants in the urban than in the forested ponds. And that makes sense because that's, there's pipes bringing the pollutants right to them. We also found higher concentrations of almost all pollutants in the urban area as in the forested area. But something I want to point out is that there's just a lot of different pollutants here in all of them. So in an average sample from a urban pond, we were finding 20 pollutants and almost 10 in a forested pond. And there's lots, and this is actually only looking at the non-mineral pollutants. This is before we have heavy metals in the data set. So these numbers will all go up still. So to show you the different types of pollutants that we're finding, first and foremost, we notice that there are lots of different types of pesticides, all those different herbicides and insecticides and everything I was mentioning before. So far, they've detected 42 different types of pesticides that have been being found in these samples. We're finding plasticizers, we're finding flame retardants, all sorts of things that we know, especially in the urban area, are harmful to human health and to animal health, and we're finding them in these ponds. And I'm someone who, when I was in graduate school, I worked in trying to determine what some of the safety levels are for aquatic organisms for different types of pesticides. And so I was part of an independent lab that was funded by chemical companies to say, okay, test our pesticide and see how safe it is for things. And so I've sort of seen how the process happens of, many of these compounds here have gone through testing for safety and effectiveness, and they've been approved as being safe and effective, and they're being used in the environment. But when I've seen how some of those tests are conducted and how some of the data is reported and how it's interpreted and what's get published and what doesn't, I don't have a lot of confidence in that process of determining the actual long-term safety of many of these compounds, and especially when they're interacting with so many other things in the wild. And so, but once something's approved and once something's out in the environment and once it's in the bloodstream of the organisms, even if you find out, years later that it was really bad, it's really hard to take back out. A lot of these things are really persistent. So there have been lots of examples like DDT and atrazine and pentachlorophenol and 6-PPD quinone now, where they went through testing, they went through safety and effectiveness testing, seemed like everything was okay. And then down the line, there was some complicated, long-term interaction that ended up being really devastating. But by that point, it's really hard to get it back out. And then you might be wondering, well, what are the pathways of these pollutants getting into these ponds? And of course, the obvious one is runoff. That's why we're seeing all these pollutants in the urban area. But then another big one that we're learning about is just what's called atmospheric deposition. So a lot of these pollutants are basically, they've volatilized and they're floating around up in the air and they settle down anywhere or the rain brings them down. And so that's why we're still seeing so many in these forested ponds. So pollutants can get there even if there's not a pipe bringing them, but most of them are coming directly from the pipe. So now that I've completely depressed you with all of the different toxic chemicals that we are finding in these ponds, let's see how it's actually affecting these frogs in this case and how much we should be worried about it. So this is looking at the tadpole survival to metamorphosis. So there's lots of other things we can look at, like growth and effect on reproductive organs and all sorts of other things, which are currently being looked at right now. And there'll be more data in the next couple of years coming out about that. But let's just look at survival. How many of them that we put in there when we move them around actually survived to more metamorphosis? Okay, so this is looking at tadpole survival percentage. So up at the top, all of them would have survived, and down at the bottom, none of them were. And this is breaking it out between whether they came from a forested pond or came from an urban pond, and then whether they went into a forested pond or went into an urban pond. And this right here, this simple graph is, the one I've been waiting for over a decade to wonder how are these things doing. And what I was really worried about is that all the ones going into a forested pond would be high, where they survive great and fine out in the forested area. And then all the ones going into an urban pond would be really low, where they're just all dying and we're drawing them into their death. So this was really exciting to me, actually, to see this relative, not a huge difference between groups here. So the ones that are, no matter where they were born, we're seeing a really similar survival rate, whether they're raised in the forest or in the urban. So even though there are tons of pollutants in there, they're still surviving at a very similar rate to they do in the forested area. So that's really good news. These that I'm showing you right here, though, are only the ponds where we found the frogs breeding in the wild. I haven't showed you yet those other sites we had where we don't see them in the wild. So what happens when we put them there? So it's a bit of a different story. It's kind of hard to almost see this data here because over half the data is down here at 0, where there is 0% survival. So in general, there is a lot lower survival when we tried to take the frogs and put them into somewhere where they're not occurring naturally in the wild. There's lots of variation here. There's lots of different things going on. And if you want to ask more about it in the questions, I can talk more about it. But in general, it seemed like in one site, all of the embryos died right before, or before they even hatched, right? So they died while they're in the egg. And it seemed to be that at that site, there was a lot of sediment, and the sediment was actually getting on the outside of the eggs and looked like it was completely suffocating them. So it could be that there are pollutants in the sediment and that those were getting into the embryos and killing the developing embryos. But I think it might just be that the sediment is blocking the oxygen from being able to get in there. So in that case, it's not even the toxic pollutant, it's just sort of the physical sediment was causing a problem. In another pond where they all died right before metamorphosis. So they had hatched, they were growing, everything was fine, and they all died when they looked about like this little frog right here. And that was likely because we had a really warm spell and the pond got really low and really hot really quickly, and the dissolved oxygen dropped a lot. And they probably died because they didn't yet have their developed lungs to breathe the air from outside the water. And so in that case as well, it didn't seem to be related to any particular toxic chemical. It was more this physical feature of that pond wasn't quite deep enough for how quickly it was drying, and the frogs need the water there long enough to be able to go through metamorphosis. And then another pond, they survived pretty similarly to in the ponds where we see them in the wild. So that might just be a case where they haven't been able to get there because there's not a lot of habitat around it. So lots of different things going on. So to answer our research questions, can the urban stormwater ponds support tadpole survival at similar rates to forested ponds? We found yes, which is really exciting. And so are these urban stormwater ponds acting as ecological traps? It doesn't seem to be, at least here. Now, of course, we need to look at more ponds, we need to look at more species, we need to look at all those sublethal effects, but at least on the surface, it's not clear that we're just drawing them in and they're all perishing. So I think it's really important that we keep designing the urban ponds as habitat and focusing on those key features. So something that we've found through the research over the years is the most important thing really is that there's water there for the time that they need it. So usually about January through June, there's enough water. They generally like 1 to 2 feet of water, so make sure it doesn't dry up too soon. They like plants in the water, especially small stemmed emergent vegetation, so things like sedges and rushes. They actually really love reed canary grass as well, which is an introduced species. Cattails are fine. But they need some sort of plant that's below the water surface. And yeah, basically they need water there long enough is the most important thing. And they like shallow slopes. If it's a bunch of vertical sides, they're gonna have a problem. So in general, what I've found is that even though these ponds aren't perfect, there's all these pollutants in them. A dirty pond is better than no pond at all, right? Before we built these ponds, often there's no wetland habitat in the entire area. And so, you know, any wetland species would rather have a dirty pond to try to live in than no pond. But at the same time, it's really important to try to keep these ponds as clean as possible, especially not only for the things that are living there, but for everything downstream too. It can do a better job of cleaning if there's, you know, fewer pollutants going in there. So continuing to do everything I talked about trying to reduce those pollutants, because a clean pond is even better than a dirty pond, and it'll benefit everything downstream as well. Okay, so for the last couple minutes, I'll just talk about some things that you can do to help amphibians that are living in stormwater ponds, try to keep those pollutants down. The clearest simple mantra is what we would call only rain down the storm drain. So if you're thinking about something and you're seeing it go into the drain or think it might get into the drain, just ask yourself, is it rain? And if the answer is no, then it shouldn't go in the drain. So someone might say, well, can't I wash my car with biodegradable soap and let it run down the drain? Well, technically that's allowed according to our regulations, but is it rain? No. Even those biodegradable soaps can have really devastating impacts on the streams where as they biodegrade, it's similar to those algae blooms where as it biodegrades, it uses up the oxygen in the pond or stream and can cause things to die from not enough oxygen. So only rain down the storm drain, minimize fertilizers, follow the label, of course, don't over apply. Choosing slow release formulations helps. And you can use mulch or grass clippings to help fertilize lawns instead of using fertilizer. Keeping cars maintained so they're not leaking. I mean, driving less in general is helpful when possible, using public transit, all of that. Minimizing erosion so that the sediment and the things bound to it don't get into the ponds. And minimizing pesticides in general. And there are a lot of things I hope some of you maybe learned that you might not have realized were pesticides, but when I listed like, oh, right, that's meant to kill something and therefore it could kill things in the pond or stream as well. Of course, if you are going to use them, be sure to follow the label and not over apply. You can choose less toxic methods, you know, things like hand weeding. And there's a good resource here for yard and garden ways to manage lawns, for example. So those important features for habitat, like I said, are making sure there's standing water through midsummer, doesn't dry up too quickly, plants with parts below the water surface, so plants that are rooted in the soil and grow up to the water surface, and then sort of these shallow sloping open areas for basking. The tadpoles love to sit here and soak up the sun this time of year. It's a great time to go out and try to see tadpoles, by the way. If you go to ponds that you think might have frogs in them, especially on a sunny day, they'll probably be in those shallow areas, and as you walk up, they'll probably all squiggle away. If you're going to do any work in a pond, you know, if you're going to disturb things, take out plants, dig it down, this is, you know, we do maintenance on our stormwater ponds, getting sediment out. The timing's really important. So like I said, the eggs are in January through March. The tadpoles are in April through July. So if you're working in those times, you could be affecting them. So if you're going to do work in a pond, August through December is great. And for a lot of these ponds that dry up, they'll probably be dry during that, August, September time anyway. So it's a good time to get in there and work. And then the last thing I'll mention is that we found that some of our ponds have what we call death trap hazards, where there's, some sort of sump in a catch basin or an outlet pipe that ends up trapping them. So the little tadpoles get sucked into this outlet and then they get caught down in this sump and they can't get out. And here are a bunch of baby little red-legged frogs. We have a little loop every May or June that we go around to and fish all the little frogs out of there. Look, you can see there are hundreds of them stuck down in this little one. So we try to avoid that now when we're designing ponds, but it's something to look for. If you think there might be an area they're getting trapped, you can go check it out in May or June and help rescue them. All right, and that's all I've got for now. So I'd be happy to answer questions. If you have anything else you want to email me about, there's an email down there.
Yeah, and I just put that email also in the chat so you can copy it and it will be on our website. Thank you, Katie, so much. And thanks for the shout out. But yeah, definitely interested. I've always kind of had some of those same lingering questions about the chemicals in the water and what's happening. So we do have a number of great questions and a lot of kind of similar-ish questions. So I might try to lump a couple together.
Great.
But I think you kind of just covered it, but what design elements can we add to stormwater ponds and green infrastructure to improve habitat for amphibians? And then to kind of add to that, how do you mitigate for negative effects to amphibians when you're cleaning those?
Yeah, great. Yeah, there's a couple things I'll add that I didn't say yet. A few things that we've done in our design standards is anytime there's something big enough for amphibians, which is, like maybe about the size of a bedroom or more. I mean, it can be, like I showed you that really small one, but anytime you have a neighborhood pond or a bigger pond, when possible, we've tried to design it so that it has some standing water in it. That it does, often the drainage pipe would be right at the bottom. So it's made to fill up like a bathtub and drain totally down, and then it's not habitat at all. So we've designed it so the outlet pipe is 1 to 2 feet above the bottom of the pond so that it can actually have some water sitting in there. It's often called a wet pond, stormwater pond. And then that emergent vegetation is really important. So planting sedges and rushes in there. If the cattails come in, that's fine too. And making sure that there are shallow side slopes. So I showed one picture where a lot of stormwater ponds that are built now are, 1 or 2 or 3 sides that are completely, like construction blocks, and then one sloping side. And sometimes we find them breeding in there, but a lot less so. It's way better if you can have sloping sides all around if you have the room. And then in terms of maintenance, other than the timing of it, doing it when it's dry, which you probably will anyway, what we've found is if you go in, if you let everything like really grow up a lot, and then you go in and scrape it all down to the bottom, every 5 years or whatever your cycle is, that can be really disruptive. So what we've started to do is instead of doing our ponds every 5 years, we'll do half of the pond every 3 years. And we'll go in and, our maintenance guys still really like to scrape it down to the bottom when they go. They don't want to, pick and choose little areas, but if you can say, let's do half each time you go in and then do that maybe every 3 years, we tend to find a lot of the amphibians hanging out right at that border where maybe over here is really dense cattail, maybe too dense for them to even be in, not much standing water. And then over here is just deep, water with no plants at all. But right at that border edge where like the fronds are leaning over and there's some, edge habitat basically in there is where we get it. And then the plants can kind of recolonize. So that's one thing we've done is maybe half at a time any given year.
Yeah, and that's something that we found out in our study too, was just about like that sloping and the importance of having a variety, especially if you want a pond that supports multiple different species, because some like different depths and not just like one and done, like a box wetland system. And then the importance of both I know that you talked a lot about the vegetation in the pond, but like one of the things that we found in our study too was the importance of the vegetation around the pond as well. And
Right.
so thinking about some of those like landowners that live right near it or have a pond like that was able to be colonized by some of these species, like how like they usually have nice upland habitat next to them as well. So anyways, so I know that you talked a lot about like different chemicals. If you had to say the top 3 stormwater based chemicals that impact amphibians, what are the top 3?
Ooh, good one. Yeah, I'd probably say sediment's the number one, which, often we don't think of as like a chemical, but it's a pollutant for sure.
Mhm.
The second one would be maybe a specific type of pesticide called atrazine, which it's not used a ton in Oregon, but it's used quite a bit. And it's used a lot in the Midwest. I recommend looking up if you're interested in it. There's a researcher named Tyrone Hayes who's done a lot of research on that. I worked with him in grad school. He has a really great TED talk talking about it. Um, and Ooh, third one. Oh no. I don't know. Do you have any other? I feel like, yeah, sediment and then, I mean, the pesticides in general. And I think the more we're learning about the pesticides, the more we're realizing that there are combined effects. There's a new one, Bifenthrin, that just got on our, I think, oh yeah, I mentioned it as a perimeter spray. We had no idea that it was a huge problem, and now we're seeing it be toxic in really low doses. So yeah, avoid the perimeter spray if you can.
Okay. I think I understand this question. Do the constructed ponds make better habitat since they don't have natural predators?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Um, Sometimes yes. So the main natural predator that amphibians hate so much they generally avoid entirely is fish. And this can be a problem with ponds. Like many of the natural ponds are often backwaters or connected to streams, or if in a restoration project they'll put in a pond and it'll be a backwater or side channel of a stream. And the amphibians just usually won't breed there because there are too many fish. They won't even try because they'll just get eaten. And so, yeah, a stormwater pond usually doesn't have any fish in it, right? So that can be a benefit. And then there are other major predators, as tadpoles at least, are dragonfly and beetle larvae. And why that's important is that those animals need to get to ponds by flying there, right? The adults fly there and lay their eggs, and then the larvae are, or the nymphs are the predators. And so a lot of these species, especially the Pacific tree frog, is a really common one. A reason it colonizes new ponds so quickly, I've been told from other research, is that those new ponds usually won't have the dragonflies or the beetles in them yet. It usually takes those predators a couple years to find it. And so the frogs are really good at somehow sensing when there's a new pond out there and like making their way across the landscape and trying to colonize it. And they usually get like a year or two of this honeymoon year where there aren't dragonfly or beetle nymphs in there yet. So even just building new habitat in and of itself can be helpful.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I know that that was one of the things we looked at the age of the pond and
Uh-huh.
to the level of like what you were talking about with scraping. And then even with that like half scraping thing that you suggested, you would still have that. But sometimes we were realizing that the young ones like had a bunch of things that would move into it for like a certain period of time. And it could be a little bit to do with those natural predators. I hadn't thought
Cool.
about that before. So we were really stuck on the like vegetation and sediment and other
Right.
aspects of the pond habitat there. Okay, so let me jump over to one of these. What characteristics of constructed ponds make them preferable habitat over natural ponds?
Yeah.
So
So
yeah.
yeah, in my study, and I showed those bars, the main reason was that it met the constructed ponds tended more often to meet the requirements of just having water at the right time of year at the right depth. And then especially they like the ones that would dry up in the summer, partially because then they don't get as many of those dragonfly and beetle predators. So most of our native amphibians love a pond that's around January through June and then dry for a few months. And the constructed ponds often were of sort of that medium size, whereas that's exactly the type of natural pond that tended to be either drained or filled in as human populations increased, where the types of ponds we tended to keep are either really tiny ornamental ponds that maybe aren't what we need at all, or sort of really big ponds that are almost like lakes. They tend to have fish, maybe they're too deep, and sort of that medium-sized pond that the amphibians really like were the ones that were always drained or filled in. And so as that sort of the right size and depth and hydro period are constructed, that seemed to be why they were leaning towards them.
Nice. Okay, so I'm gonna jump to a fun one that I got during the registration process. Y'all were able to ask some questions. How did you get started studying frogs?
Ooh, yeah. The real story actually is that when I was in college, I forgot about a deadline for an assignment and it was quickly due in like 20 minutes. And I looked up online, like, quick, what has to do with ecology and conservation? And a paper on frogs came up, and I'm like, cool, I'll do my project on that. And it ended up turning into a huge thesis. And so, because I liked it, so sometimes there are just these serendipitous, like, you think life's going bad and you're like, oh my God, why didn't I do my assignment on time and what's going on? And then like somehow that fills you into your exact niche that you wanted. So that's sort of the reason I did. I wasn't ever really thinking about it. But why I ended up really liking it and how I did it was that, especially in an urban area, I love that amphibians they're everywhere. You can go and find them in like pretty much every pond and go look under logs and they're all over the place. And they're an invertebrate, or sorry, they're a vertebrate that you can go find and see and hold in your hand. And like, there it is with its two big eyes looking right at me. And it's this amazing connection. I use them a lot for environmental education with children. Be like, look, these things live near your backyard and they're a lot like you, and they're really cool. And to get started studying them, I just bought myself a field guide about amphibians of the area and went out in the wet times and started looking around to see where they were.
Nice. And we actually, I'm guessing that that was the field guide that was written by Shar, and we actually had a webinar earlier where Shar joined us. So feel free to check that one out if you want to see Shar kind of in real life. So I have a couple more questions that are coming in. Hi, Katie, great research. Did you use Earl Heights as a study site? And if so, what did you find there? Are amphibians starting to colonize the upper and lower wetlands?
Ooh, yeah. So Earl Heights was one of those study sites, and that was one of the sites that was white, where it didn't have the red-legged frogs breeding there naturally, and we put it there. And it's the one that I mentioned where I said there was one pond where they actually survived just fine, like they did in the wild ponds. None of them, they died at a normal rate. So it seemed like Earl Heights might be a potential area where they could come colonize. So the history of that site is interesting in that it used to just be, well, more, a few decades ago, it was just like a little creek that ran through a site without much ponded water at all. And then beavers moved in and created this huge wetland complex there. And now it's created what looks like would be really great amphibian habitat. And while we were out there doing the experiment, we did hear Pacific tree frogs calling. So it sounds like they're colonizing the site. And often those will come in pretty quickly. And then a few years later, maybe the red-legged frogs will. So I would guess in the next few years, you'll probably start to get red-legged frogs colonizing out there.
Nice. Okay, let me make sure I read this. When the when the pesticide loaded soil, sorry, when the pesticide loaded soil in the stormwater pond is dug up and then to take into a landfill, when it rains, doesn't all the chemicals then leach out and continue this cycle?
Yeah. Great question. So a lot of these pollutants never really go away, especially heavy metals. Like zinc will be zinc until after the sun consumes the earth, right? And it's just about where it is and where it's moving. The landfills that these go to generally have like a liner, and the tests that we use look at where the leachate goes and how everything moves. And so it's designed to be, relatively protected, and, where that's going tends to not contaminate groundwater or surface water. But it's a really important point that no matter where we put these things, it's better to not have produce them in the first place. Like the pesticides, like, okay, it's better in the landfill than in the pond, and it's better getting caught in the pond than in the stream, but it's better if you just never had a factory produce it in the first place and put it on your yard. And so, sort of that reduction step is the first one.
Okay. Okay, so I'm gonna ask one last question and then we'll wrap it up. Thanks so much. So did you look at the hydro period effects such as water fluctuation differences between constructed and natural ponds?
Yeah, so I've never done a specific study on it, but just being out there and looking at things a lot, yeah, the natural ponds don't change nearly as much. They'll kind of slowly fill up in the winter and slowly drain down in the summer. Whereas these stormwater ponds, like I showed in the picture, they're made to like fill up and drain down. And that can be really hard for the amphibians to adjust to. We'd often see, they love to go out and lay their eggs right when there's a good rain. And so sometimes a pond would fill way up. They'd go and lay their eggs where they think is a really great place for them. And then the pond would drain down and all those eggs were stranded up out of the water. And so that short-term flashiness can be a problem. And so that's something that we've looked at, and basically how we've tried to mitigate that is keep those wetland plants that they want to lay their eggs on sort of down in what will be the more permanent bottom, not putting those plants sort of up on that slope that might fill up quickly during that, so that there's not sort of the temptation to do that. But even when that happens, they tend to still mostly be fine. But yeah, definitely a lot more fluctuation in the water level than in the natural ponds.
I'll just add to that, because when I was doing my study, somebody actually came out and took this video of some of these, the way that they're constructed, you'll have like a kind of a big gushing water event that will come out. And so what had happened was a red-legged frog had put their eggs right in front of basically where, when the water came out, it was like a fire hose right at their eggs. And it was really fun because I showed that video to an engineer and he was like, oh, we can just do a couple of things to try to have that so it's not such a high powered thing that's just like washing, and like you could just see the egg masses tumbling around. And so it was really cool to kind of collaborate then. And I mean, it kind of went off my plate at that point, but to then bring in engineers and think about, like, it's not just about the habitat. I mean, that's what we're talking about, but with some of these facilities, it's important to bring in like the people that are doing the maintenance, the people that are, the engineers that are thinking about better ways to design these systems so that they can take some of those things into consideration when designing and creating more of these. So
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and that's generally what we've found too. We come into it thinking like, oh no, they don't want to change things and shouldn't even say anything. And usually, you talk to the engineers or the maintenance folks and like, yeah, we can do that. We'll do it this way instead of that way. Not a problem. And usually people are like, I like frogs too. Let's do it, so.
yeah, it's a fun way to be creative and create fun solutions. So anyway, thank you, Katie, so much. I learned a lot, and hopefully you all did too. After I end the presentation, there should be a survey link. I also have, we'll put it into the chat right now. Please let us know how we are doing, and provide that feedback is really important for us. And thank you so much for joining us today during our lunch. And Katie, we always love hearing about what you're up to. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you all.
Yeah. Bye, guys.
Hey.